You know, I kind of experienced this game a little backwards, but I'm glad I finally had a chance to play it.
It's about time.
What's going on, guys? ItsGheb here, coming back to you with another episode of our ongoing Zelda marathon. Last time I talked about A Link to the Past, which if you haven't watched that video yet, I think you should definitely give it a look. Long story short, I knew going into that one I was still going to love that game, and I pretty much had nothing but glowing remarks across the board. This time around, we're taking a little bit of a sidestep onto the portable space with the series' first handheld entry, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Game Boy back in 1993. Yeah, a Zelda game for the Game Boy. You know, why not? Actually, a bit of a fun fact, Link's Awakening originally began its life as a port of A Link to the Past before development was actually shifted over into what we know of today. Which I'm sure a straight port of A Link to the Past would have been just fine, but I think the switch to Link's Awakening was probably worth it considering it placed in the low 90s on game rankings, sold over 3.8 million copies by 2004, with an additional 2.2 million coming from the DX version a few years later. The DX version is actually where I would experience the game for myself for the first time. My memory's a little fuzzy on the details, but I had an older cousin when I was younger that let me borrow Link's Awakening so I could play it on my GBA at the time. This is what it's like growing up poor, folks. Sometimes you just end up playing games a decade after they come out just because that's what somebody gave you. Being fully honest, I don't really remember much of my time playing it back then. I know I never finished it because, well shit, pretty much every Nintendo handheld I owned for the early parts of my life could just basically be considered Pokemon machines with the occasional Fire Emblem game thrown in for good measure. Though I would eventually complete a version of Link's Awakening with the 2019 remake from the Nintendo Switch. Yeah, I quite enjoyed this one when I ran through it. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Zelda game or anything, I'd probably put it somewhere in the middle of the pack if I'm being honest, but I did have a pretty great time with it. So yeah, we technically have 3 different versions of the same game to look here, but I really didn't want to play the same game 3 times in a row for this video, so just for the sake of simplicity, I'm only going to be talking about the DX version released on the Game Boy Color back in 1998. I decided to go with an emulator and play the DX version of Link's Awakening, since the updates on the original were pretty minor for the most part. And if we're being honest, the DX version really is just the better way to play the game between the two. I think I'm actually going to do a separate video on the Switch Link's Awakening, since that's easily the most ambitious remake in the franchise that we've seen. I was kind of going back and forth on how I wanted to handle the remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, as well as the HD ports for Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, so here's what I think I'm ultimately going to do. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, I'll stick with the originals, and have a section of the video I carve out talking about the 3DS remakes, and Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, I'll just play through the HD versions, since those changes are a bit more minimal. If that sounds reasonable for you guys, or you don't agree with that, or you could not care less, please be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. And hey, while you're down there, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. We're going to be doing every single Zelda game, plus a few spin-offs, so you guys aren't really going to want to miss that. But anyways, back to the game we're talking about. I have to say, I was a little nervous coming back to this one since I finished the 2019 version first, but it didn't actually take me too long to realize that what makes Link's Awakening such an amazing game in the first place was there from the get-go back in 1993. It's by no means perfect, and some of the issues that I have with the game come up all the damn time, but the things I do like, I think have really stood the test of time, and there are a couple aspects that I would really put up with some of the highest points that the series has seen. Really. That all being said, we've got a lot to discuss today, so without further ado, this is my review for The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. We got a little bit of a brief block to kick things off, so let's start off with the graphics and sound design. Talking about the graphics first, and you know, I have to admit, I have a weird soft spot for games on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Like, I don't think a lot of games from the NES and Master System era hold up too well in regards to their visuals outside of stuff like Battletoads, Super Mario Bros. 3, or the later Mega Man games. Games on the Game Boy, on the other hand, I think generally hold up a little bit better, with some games such as Donkey Kong Land, Wario Land, and the Kirby games being some of the best looking on the handheld. It's even better for the Game Boy Colors with games like Rayman and Shantae, which I still think look aesthetically pleasing to this day. So with that being said, where does Link's Awakening ultimately end up? Well, it's just sort of okay even when you compare it with other Game Boy games at the time. The 8-bit sprite work I think is pretty decent, definitely a step up from the NES Zelda games, but it doesn't really have the fluidity or expressiveness as A Link to the Past. The environments, while still looking okay, don't have as much depth as the SNES game, and enemies are nowhere near as detailed, which, you know, it's an 8-bit game versus a 16-bit game, what can you really expect? Of course, it's not going to look good in a lot of ways, but that being said, I do prefer the way that this game looks over the first 2 Zelda games, so there's always that. One of the main reasons I decided to play the DX version over the original comes with one of the most apparent changes, the addition of color. Instead of the monochrome palette of the original, Link's Awakening DX brightens up everything with a bright boost of color, making it far easier on the eyes. I don't know about you guys, but my eyesight isn't super great, and staring at a grayscale pattern for a few hours really starts to give me a bit of a headache. So it kind of goes without saying that this is the better version to play if you're like me. There are even some added cutscenes to this edition too, which, yeah, these are pretty damn good for something that's only 8-bit. Actually, one of my favorite additions has to come with the photography side quest. It's pretty inconsequential, but whenever you find a spot you get your picture taken, you get a really expressive picture of Link, which I think adds a ton to this game's charm. You can even print these pictures out on your Game Boy printer, which I'm sure you definitely own. Last thing I'll touch on with this is the sound design, which it's okay, I guess. The Game Boy and the Game Boy Color weren't exactly known for being super spectacular in the sound department, and Link's Awakening didn't really do much to change that. The music here is definitely fine, with most songs just essentially being a 1-minute loop with a few exceptions. I think the standout tracks for me would probably be Mabe Village, which kind of sounds like being in a town in a Pokemon game, and Telltale Heights that mainly gets some extra points for being one of the few pieces of music longer than 2 minutes in length. That and the remix that they had in Brawl definitely helped. Oh, and the Ballad of the Windfish is great too, especially when all the instruments are present. That being said, I think the worst part of the sound design has to be the fact of how often the music switches between different songs. Sometimes you'll be in an area that only requires like 1 or maybe 2 screens to cross, and the music will change once you enter and leave the area, meaning you'll just hear the same first 15 seconds of a song over and over and over again, and it gets a little annoying. Oh, and I'm not a fan of the power-up music. It comes up so often that I started actually skipping these drops by the end of the game, just because I was so tired of it. Super minor complaints all around. It's pretty decent for a Game Boy game, but that being said, it's a Game Boy game. You know, there's not much else you can say there. Now, something I actually do have a little bit more to talk about is Link's Awakening's story and setting. So Link's Awakening is the first game in the Zelda series that completely takes Link away from the characters and places we're used to. There's no Zelda, no Ganon, no Triforce, no Hyrule, just the same Link from A Link to the Past in a completely new setting called Koloan Island. Link washes up here after his boat gets caught in a storm, causing him to be shipwrecked, with this girl Marin finding him washed up on the beach. She takes him back to Mabe Village, and after some brief exploring, Link gets acquainted with an owl who tells him the only way to get home is to wake the island guardian, the Windfish. In order to do this, Link must travel around the island, collect 8 instruments. You can probably see where this goes from here. Now, Koloan Island is quite the interesting place. It seems like a pretty standard island at first, with its beaches, some mountainous areas, forests, and deserts, you know, stuff that you probably expect. You also get introduced to by far the most amount of NPCs the series has seen up to that point. And while they aren't the deepest characters in the world, I found the supporting cast here to still be really entertaining and honestly far more likable than anything we saw in the first 3 games. I think a big factor of that has to do with the writing. The writing in this game kind of reminds me of Earthbound or Mother 3, with its greater focus on humor, as well as just how out there some of the concepts can get. Some of the most prominent characters you meet are the owl that will guide you throughout your journey, Terran, who always seems to be involved in some sort of hijinks, and of course Marin herself. She actually has a little bit of an arc where Link and her spend some time together, and you can see she slowly starts to develop some feelings for Link. She's fascinated by him, not only because of his actions, but also because he's the first person to ever come to Koloan Island. Marin has always wanted to travel outside the island to see what else is out there, kind of like Riku from Kingdom Hearts, to slightly ruin it for you guys. But unlike Riku and wanting to use a raft to explore, she wishes to turn into a seagull and fly away. Because of Link's existence, it fills her with hope that someday her dream might actually be realized. Which, speaking of dreams, let's get into the big twist of this game. So Koloan Island might not be that different from Hyrule in terms of how the land itself is structured, but what inhabits the island is very different, we'll say. Not too far into the game, we start seeing a couple Mario references with the likes of a Yoshi doll, a chain shop outside of this house, and even Terran himself kind of looks like Mario a little bit. And you know, at first, you might think it's a cute Easter egg and move on, but these references just kind of keep coming, and later you find enemies from Mario like Goombas, Piranha Plants, Shy Guys, even Wart from Super Mario Bros. 2 shows up. And Kirby? What the hell is up with this place? Well, about halfway through the game, you learn of Koloan Island's dark secret, and that the entire island is a fabricated dream by the Windfish. And even worse, when you eventually do decide to wake the Windfish up, Koloan Island and everything and everyone on it is going to disappear and fade from existence, Marin included. That's fucking bleak. The foreshadowing for this is played up really well with the fact that no one on Koloan Island has ever seen anyone new on the island before, that many of the characters actually break the fourth wall a few times when you speak to them, and even the bosses this time around are called nightmares. Actually, as you get closer towards the end of the game too, these nightmares start to warn Link of what will actually happen if he succeeds in his quest. You don't get too much apprehension from Link on this, of course, but you as the player might start to second guess yourself on if this is the right thing to do or not. Like, is it really worth wiping out all these characters from existence just for a chance to get home that we aren't aren't even 100% sure will work. Are the nightmares we're facing really that bad, since it looks like their primary goal for stopping Link is for self-preservation, and to a greater extent that keeps everyone we met on the island alive? There's some pretty heavy questions here, and the developers have gone on record to say one of the main influences for the story for this game was Twin Peaks, and you know, I kinda see it. This is the first time that a Zelda game really got players to stop and think about the greater ramifications of what's going on, and maybe even reconsider what they're doing. And just kind of giving you guys a heads up, there aren't really too many other Zelda games that really have you do that, so it makes Link Awakening stand out a little bit. The combination of this weird as fuck setting and the morally gray outcome of our actions makes Link's Awakening an anomaly when compared to every other Zelda game before and since. But you know what? I love that about this game. Sometimes it's cool to see the familiarity thrown out the window, sometimes it's nice for a change of pace, and Link's Awakening is a game that I think really pays off in that regard. They could have maybe played this up a little bit more, I suppose, especially with the standard ending of just having Link continue to float through the ocean. Like, does Link eventually get back home? What the fuck? If you make it to the end of the game without dying once, you do get the true ending with a small cutscene of a seagull flying away, with a picture of Marin implying that she had her wish come true, but outside of that, we actually never really know what happens to all of our characters. It's left pretty ambiguous. But that's a super minor complaint for what I would consider to be one of this franchise's best stories. There's not much I would really change here, I just think it's incredibly well done. Now moving on to the general gameplay, and like I said at the beginning of this video, Link's Awakening really began its life as a port of A Link to the Past to the Game Boy, but what we ultimately got kind of feels like a halfway point in between Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past. The missing link, if you will. Like and subscribe. So much like these two games, we once again have the overhead perspective that by this point could be considered the series' MO. One thing I was actually surprised to see make the transition was the return of the diagonal movement. I totally would have assumed that we would have been locked to cardinal directions like we were in Zelda 1, but I was super happy to see how fluid this was here. It definitely makes navigating Kaloa Island far more enjoyable than Hyrule was in Zelda 1. Well, that and having a functional map helps too. But yeah, Kaloa Island, honestly pretty damn good overworld here for the most part. I'm personally a little back and forth if I like this one or Hyrule from A Link to the Past more, but I'd probably give it to Hyrule if I had to pick. I think Kaloa Island is pretty diverse in terms of biomes, and it certainly has its fair share of secrets, and the fast travel points are a decent means of getting around, but it's also not nearly as open as Hyrule, with larger chunks of the island being locked behind getting particular dungeon items in order to progress. Remember when I said that I thought A Link to the Past started to have this almost Metroidvania-like quality because of the needed item progression? Well, Link's Awakening triples down on that idea, for better or for worse. This is definitely the most linear game in the series so far. Like, with some of the later dungeons, you could technically grab an item and leave, go do something out of order, but now there are far more scripted events between the dungeons that severely limit that option. Which on one hand is nice, in the sense that one of my main complaints from A Link to the Past was that there wasn't much of a break from dungeon spamming unless you indulged in some side content. But the trade-off here is that this game definitely is not as flexible when it comes to route variety. Personally, I don't mind it though. I think the more linear structure makes Link's Awakening one of the most beginner-friendly games that we've seen up to this point. I wouldn't say you get your hand held, but you do have way more direction than ever before. You have the owl that basically always points you to your next objective, you have the phone booths scattered around the island that can provide you with some hints, and even in the dungeons you have these owl statues which will give you some pointers on how to handle some particular puzzles. These are all great. And even then, the overworld only gives you so many options on where you can progress given what items you have unlocked at the time, so it's a pretty straightforward ride for the most part. For the most part being, there is the occasional weird placement of a heart piece, and some bombable walls don't actually have cracks in them and you need to tap on them with your sword, which if you're going to want to be as thorough as possible, you're going to want to tap any area that you might be suspicious about, which can be a little annoying. Oh, and I'm not a big fan of some of the endgame dungeons. Now, most of the dungeons are a pretty comfortable ride, and actually, I like how a lot of these dungeons feel like they have a greater emphasis on puzzle solving. And you know, I also like how distinct each dungeon is from one another, like this one where you have to swim underwater to get to, or this one that requires you have to get rid of a waterfall. I don't think that these dungeons are the best in the series by any means, but they're fun enough nevertheless. I didn't really care for Eagle Tower or Turtle Rock though. These final two dungeons just dragged on for way too long. They aren't bad, but they do have a number of needless areas that you could stumble into, so they weren't exactly my favorite. The enemies and bosses that go around are also kind of a mixed bag. Standard enemies for the most part are pretty inconsequential. The most annoying enemies are probably the Wizrubs again, since they phase in and out and can't actually be damaged with your sword. And then the enemies that require you to match the patterns just because they honestly suck with the timing. Everything else though is pretty damn easy. And then there's the bosses, which are honestly a complete fucking joke. Like, look at how fast I take down this anglerfish.
was that?
If you spam the spin attack like you should, you are going to completely no-diff everything in this game. I like how each of the bosses now utilize a dungeon item in order to beat them. In fact, I would say mechanically speaking, I prefer these bosses over what we saw in A Link to the Past, with the only problem being is just they're too damn easy. So overall, the general gameplay is pretty damn good. Not as great as A Link to the Past, but you know, like I said earlier, it kind of represents the halfway point in between Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past, so I can't really complain too much here. With that being said, let's get into a little bit more of the specific aspects of Link's Awakening's gameplay. Next up, I want to talk about the items, which admittedly, this roster of items isn't as robust as what we saw in A Link to the Past, but overall, I think it's fine for the most part, even if we didn't get too many newcomers. Let's get the only new one out of the way first, the Rock's Feather. This gives Link the ability to jump. It's one of the best items in the game. You'll be using this all the damn time for either combat purposes, but also some platforming too. Now the combat applications are typically reserved to either dodging attacks or jumping up to do extra damage in an instance where the boss might be hard to hit. The platforming, on the other hand, is the real point of this item. Now there are pits and whatnot in the overhead sections that you'll need to jump over, but there's also some side-scrolling segments where the Rock's Feather will basically always be a necessity. Now in my Zelda 2 video, I saw a couple comments where people said that the side-scrolling in Link's Awakening was basically ripped wholesale from that game, but I don't completely agree with that. The side-scrolling sections basically play exactly the same as the standard overworld areas, but you can't move directly up or down. That's kind of it. If anything, I think these segments feel much closer to the side-scrolling areas from the original Zelda game rather than Zelda 2. They're pretty few and far between, but they typically provide some light platforming challenges that I think are a decent little pace breaker here and there. Also, if you fall into a bottomless pit, you don't instantly die. Point 1 for Link's Awakening. Anyway, weird little tangent aside, let's get back to talking about the items. So most of the items in this game see the return from A Link to the Past, and for the most part, I would say that they operate the same overall. The sword, the shovel, the bombs, magic powder, bow, power bracelet, flippers, Pegasus boots, hookshot, they all operate just like they did in the last game, and they're all incredibly useful. The shield is a bit of a weird case since now you have to actually press a button to activate it, but it provides much better coverage than A Link to the Past, so I think it's just fine. The two biggest glow-ups have to be the magic rod and the boomerang though. Since you don't have a magic meter in this game, you can essentially spam the rod as much as you want. You get it kind of late in the game though, so you can't really do too much with it. And then the boomerang, Jesus Christ, this thing is fucking OP, oftentimes doing more damage to enemies than your sword. You can even one-shot the final phase of the last boss if you use it. It's absolutely busted. Pretty much all the items this time around stay relevant from the time that you get them all the way up to the final encounter with the last boss, which I appreciate since the last games, you didn't really use all of your items to that same capacity. I mean, the most useless one might be the shovel that pretty much gets boxed immediately once you find all the collectibles you need, and the boomerang is completely optional, but everything else comes back for either combat or traversal purposes, which I think is really great to have. And for the most part, you get most of these items in the dungeons, but there are a couple things that you're going to need to buy from the store. Jesus Christ, look how expensive this stuff is. Like, look at the bow, holy shit. Thankfully, this game showers you in rupees, so at least it's not too difficult to get this relatively early on. That didn't stop me from trying to make off with some shit without paying though. Just make sure you never come back to that store, otherwise the shopkeeper will have you feel the wrath of God. Regardless if you come back or not, your name actually gets changed to Thief, and all the characters call you that for the rest of the game, which is honestly pretty fucking hilarious. I'm getting off topic again. Overall, the lineup of items that we see here definitely isn't my favorite in the series. I do appreciate that they stay relevant throughout the course of the game, but the roster of items here is just so small compared to A Link to the Past and games that come after it, so it's just kind of okay for me overall. So while most Zelda games post A Link to the Past take the formula that was established in that game and adds a central gameplay gimmick for a little pizzazz, the main thing that Link's Awakening has going for it is its story. That being said, the game isn't without its own bells and whistles that it adds to the formula. So since we were just talking about items, I think it's time that we talk about what most people would probably consider the worst thing about Link's Awakening, and that's the way it handles its item management system. So unlike previous Zelda games, Link this go-around actually has 2 equipable slots that he can allocate to any of his items at any given time. This in theory can make Link far more flexible since he'll be able to utilize his items in ways he couldn't before. And truth be told, you do that. You can combine the Rock's Feather and the Pegasus boots to get absolutely massive jump distances, you can combine the bombs and the arrows to make bomb arrows over a decade and a half earlier than Twilight Princess did. There's some pretty cool shit here. Ready for the problem? The Game Boy only has 2 face buttons. This means that your sword is something that must be equipped, which you can basically assume is always going to be taking up a slot. kind of putting us back to square one. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, it'll be just like Zelda 1 or A Link to the Past. That's not really too bad, but nah, it gets worse. So pretty much every item you get in Link's Awakening needs to be equipped outside of the flippers and extra tunics. So things from previous Zelda games that Link always had on, such as the Pegasus boots, power bracelets, and even the shield, must be equipped so you can use them. And now you might be saying to yourself, okay, well I'll just dedicate one button to the sword and one button to whatever the most useful item Link needs is at the time. And that's ultimately what you're going to end up doing, but the next issue comes up with the level design of Link's Awakening. You remember earlier where I said that this game hard locks you to some dedicated pathways until you have the right item to clear certain obstacles? Well, as the game opens up more and more and more, you're going to have to do more running around, which means backtracking through certain areas, which you will need certain items equipped in order to pass through. This means every couple of screens opening up the menu, selecting the item that you need, passing the obstacle, and in some cases, re-equipping the item that you just took off. That process only takes a couple of seconds, but you are doing this constantly, especially in some of the late game dungeons where you'll be doing it multiple times in one room. It's a constant pace breaker and a small waste of time that adds up more and more as you go throughout the game, and it gets very annoying. That and God help you if you accidentally bump into something that requires you have the power bracelet or Pegasus boots on in order to pass. The amount of times I saw the, wow, that looks really heavy, you won't be able to lift this with your bare hands message was pretty unnecessarily ridiculous. This game really should have at least had something like the power bracelet be a context sensitive tool, and the shield to always be on and act like how it did in A Link to the Past or Zelda 1. You know how for a long time everyone bitched about the water temple in Ocarina of Time because you had to keep taking the iron boots on and off? Imagine that throughout the entire game, and that's what you're getting with Link's Awakening. Thankfully, this issue is taken care of in the 2019 Switch remake, so it's definitely worth considering that version in this instance. But yeah, that's the worst thing about OG Link's Awakening. I don't think I'm going to get too many people disagreeing with me on that. Let's focus on some more positive stuff. So one of the big features that Link's Awakening had a larger focus on was the scaled up side content. Now, the previous Zelda games had stuff like optional health upgrades to collect or mini-games to score extra rupees, and those exist here too, but now we get full-on quest chains to do, and I honestly really recommend trying them in order to get the full Link's Awakening experience. The biggest thing that we have right away is the new collectible seashells. So around the island, Link will occasionally find seashells that he can grab in order to bring them to the mansion to later earn a reward. There are 26 of these things in total, but you only need 20 of them to claim the final reward, and personally, I love when games do this with collectibles. Give me some wiggle room in case I miss something, but still allow me to get the reward if I at least meet the threshold. Getting 20 of these seashells upgrades your sword and it adds the ability for it to shoot sword beams, which you definitely want, so go ahead and try to find them. Most of them are in pretty easy to find locations, so it's not that big of an ask. Link's Awakening also introduced the first multi-step trading quests in the franchise. You guys know how these works. You collect the loosely related series of useless items that you trade with NPCs dotted around the map to get something a little bit more useful, in this case the OP as fuck boomerang, so I 100% recommend going through with this. This time around you basically have to do half of it anyways to progress through the story, so you might as well complete it to get one of the best weapons in the game. On the minigame side of things, we have the trendy game. It sucks. It's actually not too bad when you get the timing down, and it's a pretty decent method of grinding rupees, even though I personally prefer the River Rapids trip since I think it's a little bit more on the fun side of things. There's also fishing, which is a first for the series. It's pretty bare bones, but hey, it's fishing, so that already gives it an extra 2 stars. Oh, what else is there? Oh, we have the first instance of an ocarina being added. I guess this technically could have fit into the item section, but hey, we'll talk about it here. So as Link travels around Coloent, he will actually get new songs that he can play on his ocarina, just like in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Now, unfortunately, those songs are nowhere near as useful as they are in those games. Actually, 2 of the songs are just glorified progression checks, with the other one being used to either warp to a certain part of the map or get to the dungeon's entrance. But this was the first technical instance of being able to choose to play different songs on an instrument, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Can you tell I'm starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel here? Let's wrap this section up. Link's Awakening doesn't really focus too much on a central gameplay mechanic like later games do, but instead looks to flesh out and adds more side content to what was already established in A Link to the Past, and for the most part, I once again think it does a great job. Outside of the item management, of course, but hey, it's fixed in the remake, so maybe play that one. Couple of minor things I want to get to before we wrap this video up, and I just want to briefly go over a couple things that the DX version has over the original Link's Awakening. This is the deluxe version after all, so what have we got to play with? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the game went from a monochrome grayscale to a much wider color palette, and with it being a game released only a few months after the launch of the Game Boy Color, you know this is the thing that pretty much everyone wanted to see. So Nintendo went the extra mile and put a whole new color-themed dungeon for players to explore in this version. It's kind of shit. I mean, layout-wise, it's basically a straight shot to the end. The puzzles are laughably easy. It's in a really random area. The only thing of note here is the reward for completing the dungeon is a tunic that can either give you double damage or double damage resistance. Great reward. I chose the resistance since the spin attack already decimates things enough, and I didn't feel like one-shotting everything for my playthrough. Most of the other additions are pretty minor. You of course have some bug fixes, the new cutscenes were impressive for the Game Boy Color, the more specific hints in the dungeons are a nice addition, and the whole picture minigame, while not having a big reward or anything, does add some fun charm to the game. It's a host of super minor changes, so if you're ultimately going to decide to play the original version of Link's Awakening over the DX version, your experience isn't going to differ that much. I personally recommend the DX version over the original just because of the added color, but hey, if you're a purist, you can't really go wrong either way. This section of the video could have been an email. It might be kind of obvious now, but I'm starting to run out of things to say about Link's Awakening, so let's wrap this up. I love Link's Awakening. It's an amazing game. I don't have a lot of experience with the other 2D Zelda games, only finishing Four Swords Adventures and playing a bit of Minish Cap, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks, while all the other ones have gone unplayed by me, but I'm honestly feeling pretty confident when I say that I think Link's Awakening is probably going to sit pretty close to the top of that lineup. Hell, I would even put it close up there with other games in the series I love, such as A Link to the Past and Twilight Princess. It's seriously that good. The world and story of Kelowna Island is fantastic. The new focus on side content is great, and to fit all this on a handheld back in the early 90s is most certainly a technical feat. The only thing that's really holding this game back is, again, the really awkward item management and how often you need to switch stuff. Thankfully, the Switch remake does address this issue, but there are a couple of things that come up with that version that are also a bit of a problem, but I'll talk about that when I eventually get to that video. This game though, no matter what version you play, gets an easy recommendation from me. It's available on the Switch Online service, or if you can find a physical copy or grab it on an emulator, I think it's definitely worth your time. I'm really glad I finally got to go back and experience this one. I can't wait to play it again sometime in the future. But that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.